Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is Konstantinos Charlos. I'm an assistant professor of international relations at Ozyegin University, and today I'm going to talk to you about a measurement instrument I have developed, Interstate Managerial Coordination. What is Interstate Managerial Coordination, or IMAC? It's a reliable and replicable measurement instrument that is used to capture the engagement by groups of states in the international system in the regulation of the use of force via managerial coordination characterized by consultation, multilateralism, and the avoidance of adversarial coordination. Now, what is managerial coordination? The concept that I'm trying to capture with IMAC. It is a concept that comes from the issue paradigm, and it's essentially a kind of rules-making game, where the goal is to create new systemic rules that foster the use of specific allocation mechanisms to resolve issues and inhibit the use of other allocation mechanisms. To be more exact, managerial coordination tries to create allocation mechanisms that are likely to lead to the pacific resolution of issues and inhibit states from choosing power political allocation mechanisms that tend to be fostered by realist systemic rules that, as we know from work like Steps to War, tend to be associated with the onset of war. Now, why engage managerial coordination? My argument is basically that decision makers become dissatisfied with the results of the allocation mechanisms that are fostered by the realist system, and essentially they're trying to avoid war. Now, if all that's going here is that the decision makers of a couple of countries decide they don't want to fight each other, then to be frank, likely they don't need to do a lot. A very simple way to avoid that is simply not to bring certain issues on the agenda. They have already selected themselves out of the endogenous causes of war. However, if they're coming out of a system which was realist, they have likely engaged in a lot of external balancing, which is an allocation mechanism fostered by realist systemic rules. And that external balancing creates these linkages, networks of linkages, alliances, patron-client relationships, and so on with other states beyond their immediate circle. Now, here's what happens. If the decision makers of that inner group of states, let's call them a core for the time being, decide they don't want war, the problem is that the decision makers of the other states, the outer group of states, the ones that they're linked to, have not changed their views on the realist power politics yet. And they're willing to engage in war. And when those allies and proxies or clients fight each other, they transmit through their linkages domestic pressures by hardliners that essentially demand the use of power politics allocation mechanisms in order to resolve issues. So the likelihood of war outside of those countries in which decision makers wish to avoid it can undermine their attempts. The solution to that is to regulate the use of force, not just between the countries which have already selected out of it, but also with those countries linked to them, whose engagement in war can undermine their attempts to resolve their issues pacifically. This is why you engage in managerial coordination. Now, in order to explain how managerial coordination leads to peace, we have to have an underlying theory of war. A theory of peace requires a theory of war. The theory of war that underpins my arguments is essentially a mix of the Steps to War explanation and the Rationalist explanations of war. And the idea here is that war is a conscious decision made by hardliner decision makers who dominate the decision process that is taking place in an environment that creates bounded rationality and is dominated by systemic rules that foster the use of war as an allocative mechanism. Now, when you engage in managerial coordination, here is how you undermine those causal factors of war. Consultation undermines private information and permits coordination along other allocation mechanisms, other alternative allocation mechanisms. Multilateralism alleviates the shadow of the future by making states more confident of the longevity of allocation decisions, and also increases the reliability and efficiency of those alternative allocation mechanisms by creating large groups of states that are willing to enforce their use and to reward their use. Finally, when states avoid adversarial coordination, that means coordinating with each other in order to essentially do external balancing and to create alliances to hurt other states. They alleviate private information, they isolate potential spoiler regimes, and finally they decrease the mass of the linkage network that can lead to war. Now, how can we code managerial coordination? In the past, Peter Wallensteen tried to do that through universalism and particularism. However, the problem with that attempt was that it was neither replicable nor reliable. So there's need for something new. Based on those ideas of Wallensteen, I built a more sensitive and more variable measure. And my argument is simple. There are certain behaviors in which states engage, especially in a subsystem of states or a network system, which fit each element of managerial coordination. So when states engage in these behaviors, they are engaging essentially in behaviors that foster managerial coordination. For consultation from the extant literature, it seems to be the case that participation in intergovernmental organizations and congress systems like the Congress of Vienna tends to play that role. For multilateralism, participation in managerial alliances that essentially include the majority or almost all of the states in a subsystem and do not explicitly target one of the states that is not a part, also play that role in essentially helping coordination. The lack of adversarial coordination, on the other hand, is negatively coded. In this case, the argument is this: if the states of our network are engaged in a specific set of behaviors, unilateral alliances, or the linking of strategic rivalries, then they essentially send signals to the system that they are still beholden to realist systemic rules and have a preference for power political allocation mechanisms. So even if they engage in consultation and multilateralism, engaging in adversarial coordination undermines those attempts. Now, I code the presence of each element as a 1 or a 0, except from the lack of adversarial coordination. In this case, what I do is I code whether states fail to avoid adversarial coordination. And arbitrarily, I also decide to give higher weight to that last element than the other two cooperative, because the idea is if states are engaged only in consultation or multilateralism and at the same time in adversarial coordination, it's going to dampen any pacific effects. Even when they're engaged in both of the cooperative elements, there's still going to be a dampening, but my argument is there that it's going to be less. Now, this is an arbitrary choice, okay? Probably there is a way to find some kind of empirical measure instead to use for a weight, but it works. It works. And I think that as long as you accept it, and I think the logic behind it is defensible, it works. And that creates a 6-category measurement instrument. Now, I have coded IMAC for the major power subsystems, so 1715 to 2010, and you can see in the table over there the sources of that coding. And the important thing here is this, that all of this is coded on extant literature, on extant data sets. So that makes it very replicable. Okay, it's very replicable. Anybody following my Godi decisions will have the same results. And that was not the case with universalism particularism. And if you do that coding, here's what you look. This is how the intensity of great power engagement in managerial coordination looks for this whole 300-year period. And what you can immediately get out of it is that 58% of the time, 58% of the system years, the great powers have been terrible at this. Managerial coordination was non-existent or very, very weak. And only for 22% of those years they have been able to engage in robust managerial coordination. So in general, they have been unable to escape from the realist systemic rules, but not always. Sometimes they have been able to create credible alternatives, and those credible alternatives can have an impact, potentially. Now, Managerial coordination is also reliable. I know this from the extant research I've done. I used it to evaluate, interrogate a puzzling finding that Wallensteen and Senese found using universalism particulars. And what they found is that universalism doesn't tend to be associated with the avoidance of war between minor powers and major powers, even though it's associated with major peace. And what I found is that a lot of the years coded as universalism or particularism by Wallensteen are actually, if you use IMAC, characterized either by very high managerial coordination for particularist years or very low managerial coordination for universalist years. And that told me something is going on here. And what happened is I reran Wallensteen and Shakazenski's research design, and what I found is that if you use IMAC, then it's actually the case that high levels of managerial coordination are indeed associated with a dampening of military conflict between minor powers and minor powers. Currently, I'm also using IMAC as an independent variable and trying to see its impact on the steps to war. I'm also looking at the correlates of IMAC among the major powers, why major power decision makers engage in IMAC. In this case, it's a dependent variable. IMAC can be used for many other things. It is it's a much more richer measure, so it can be used for more sophisticated explorations of the relationship between structure, essentially polarity, for example, and system, essentially what kind of systemic rules predominate in the international system. IMAC can be coded for any group of states in the international system, and it will be worthwhile to sit down and do that coding. For example, the Scandinavian states, or perhaps the Iberian Peninsula, and so on. It will be a way to get at why some areas have become security communities and why some have failed. And finally, IMAC can be used as independent variable, looking at whether it fosters the use of other Pacific allocation mechanisms like third-party arbitration, and also to look at comparisons of decision-making processes under different systemic rules. You can learn more about this, the theory behind it, the story behind it, the tests, the coding, the data, by looking at any of the works I've listed there, and you can find the existing great power data set of interstate managerial coordination in the link there. Thank you very much for your time. Looking forward to your questions.